On today's show, the future of John Carlson with the Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme. I've covered the Capitals for the last 3 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called the Capitals Minute Cast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about Anthony Beauvillier and how he wants to stay in DC, but will the Capitals commit? Listen, we saw a promising performance out of Anthony Beauvillier, but is he worth signing up to a long-term deal? I'll talk about that a bit later. I'll talk about Nicklas Backstrom is heading home as I reflect on the end of a legendary NHL career. And it's interesting that, there hasn't been a lot said about it. It was just the end of the season. And then we heard that his house that was in Virginia went up for sale. And now the plan is for him to go back to Sweden and play hockey. What's the latest with Nicky? But just to get it going here, what's next for John Carlson and why the Caps are in no rush to extend him? And this is an interesting topic for me to talk about, as John Carlson has been a huge piece on this team for years. And it's interesting that, he didn't have the kind of performance that he had hoped for in the playoffs, but neither did Alex Ovechkin. Neither did a lot of different players on the Capitals roster. But it's interesting that John Carlson and Alex Ovechkin, 2 players that have been pillars on this team for years, just because they didn't really pop off the page in the playoffs. Some people are like, yeah, those guys can hang up the skates. Let's not forget about what kind of player John Carlson is, the record numbers that he puts up, playing routinely 23 plus minutes a night, that it's not going to be plug and play to just replace him with anyone. Now, the flip side of that coin is, however, is that he is only under contract next season. And then a lot of question marks about John Carlson. How do the Capitals proceed? This is a team that wants to get younger. It wants to get faster. And if there is a cautionary tale, is that maybe the Capitals held on to TJ Oshie too long. Maybe the Capitals held on to Nick Backstrom too long, as you saw diminished returns. I think in a lot of ways, the Capitals sometimes reach for familiarity. That's why they reached or where they kept Nicklas Backstrom and TJ Oshie on the roster as long as they did, even though we knew that Nick Backstrom was going to be a tough return given that hip resurfacing procedure, and TJ Oshie and his injury. They still like to hang on to familiarity. It's interesting with John Carlson. They might be the wise idea if this team is trying to shift in a different direction. Then maybe the Capitals should explore other options other than John Carlson. But that's what we're going to dive into in segment number 1. To say that John Carlson is still a key piece of the Capitals' blue line is an understatement. Still logging big minutes and still productive, but with just 1 year left on his deal, there's a big question. Should the Caps re-sign him now or wait it out? And, you take a look at it. He is 35 years old. He is on the back 9 of his hockey career, still puts up good numbers. But when are we going to start to see a dip in production? And at that point, is it too late? And I guess what I'm trying to say is I compared Nicklas Backstrom and TJ Oshie. Could the Capitals have got a bigger return on those players had they parted ways with them before it got to the point where they couldn't even play hockey anymore? Kind of the same category somewhat as John Carlson, still considered a really sound defenseman. Do the Capitals, do they hang on to him? Do they sign him to an extension? And is that the right idea? And are you going into it for the right reasons? Are you going into it because of, the warm fuzzies that you think about when you think of John Carlson and the familiar faces that are slowly peeling away. Like I said, Nick Backstrom, TJ Oshie, Alex Ovechkin after that, John Carlson, that this team is going to take on a new identity. And I think it's going to be difficult for us Capitals fans to embrace that. But that is what is staring the Capitals squarely in the face. Chris Patrick made it clear this week there's nothing imminent this summer. And honestly, it makes sense. And like I said, the Capitals are entering into a transitional phase, not a full rebuild, but certainly a reset. Semantics, I guess, at the end of the day. Young defensemen like Vincent Iorio are knocking on the door, and they need ice time. Carlson, like I said, that's 35, was a rock-solid player in the regular season, 51 points, a plus 17 rating, averaging at nearly 24 minutes per game. And, so there's two sides to this. I vacillate on it, that I understand the importance and don't walk away from this podcast saying that I'm not a super fan of John Carlson. And I am, but, just like everyone else, he's not getting any younger. And why didn't we see that performance that we saw from John Carlson in the postseason that we saw in the regular season? And that's an interesting thing. I was waiting for, he was dealing with a nagging injury, but we've waited long enough and nothing has come out, that there is a lot of questions about Carlson and what gives there. In the playoffs, just 3 points in 10 games, and he looked a step slower. That's what I'm talking about. Before you say, there is no way we're moving on from John Carlson, he is the guy on the blue line. I get that. And that feeling resonates within me as a Capitals fan. However, let the past, Nick Backstrom, TJ Oshie, these kind of guys, let that be a lesson that sometimes a team can hold on to a player for too long. Or if you want to take a look at an organization that was a little slow to the punch as well, is the Pittsburgh Penguins. And, and I'm drawing comparisons here because it kind of ties in with Carlson, is that, I guess a good thing is that Nick Backstrom voluntarily walked away. TJ Oshie couldn't play anymore. So it made it easy for the Capitals. John Carlson is still a player that can play. Are they going to make that hard decision and try to move him, or are they going to sign him to a short-term deal? It's going to be interesting to see what kind of tactic Chris Patrick and the Capitals take. And Carlson is still valuable, maybe even essential for one more season, but the Caps have to consider age, cap space, and future leadership. The changes is coming. Alex Ovechkin, I think, is embracing it wholeheartedly. He knows who he is. He knows that he's going to be 40 next season, and I would be most surprised if he signs an extension in an NHL team, not just the Capitals, but in the NHL in general. It's good to have a good understanding of where you are at what stage of life. You take a look at Jaromir Jagr, for example, where it's almost kind of turning into a circus surrounding him, that I don't think that a lot of these players want to enter into that realm. So what does that mean for next year? He likely stays, but after that, if Carlson wants term or big money, things could get complicated. If he's open to shorter deals and mentorship roles, he could be a part of the Capitals' next era. So he does hold a value in that regard as leadership. But with that said, even if it's a shorter term deal, do you want a diminished John Carlson? Because for whatever reason, we saw a diminished John Carlson in the playoffs. That if you sign him to a deal and say he's not the John Carlson that we remember from, years before, did you hold on to him too long? And let's be real, you don't replace 23 minutes a night easily. So it's not going to be an easy situation for the Capitals to make. But the clock is ticking, and the Caps are watching the kids that are ready to come up and take it to the next level. Vincent Iorio, you hear Chase Prisky, these kind of guys, that there are players in the wings, not to mention, younger prospects playing in the junior level, that kind of thing, that, there is going to be the next wave of Capitals. It's Leonard, it is Crystal, Mirshnashenko, these kind of guys, but there's going to be big changes on the entire lineup. I guess the net minding is the thing that's pretty buttoned up here for the foreseeable future. But as far as the forwards and defense It's going to change. Big changes here within the next couple of years. And it's a tough decision. Do they hold on to John Carlson for who he once was? Or do they make a tough decision to help the overall good of this team in the long term? All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about Nick Backstrom's quiet goodbye and what lies ahead for Nicky. I'll discuss straight ahead. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in. Your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it is a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. And when I started using Monarch, I realized how much money I was spending on going out to eat, takeout, those kind of things. And now I budget smarter. And the good thing about Monarch Money is you can plan your financial future if you have a spouse or a significant other in one fluid suite where you can kind of see controlled spending. So you're not overspending in certain areas. And if you realize you're spending too much in one area, it kind of gives you ideas on how to better spend your money. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me over on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in this next segment here, Nick Backstrom, good old number 19, and how he kind of quietly went out into the sunset. Not the way that I had hoped that it would go. I was hoping that there would be a bit more ceremony surrounding a guy that has been absolutely huge for this team for years. And it's quite a statement to make that Alex Ovechkin would not be the player he is today had it not been for Nicklas Backstrom. Make no mistake about it. Alex Ovechkin, the guy that loved living in the limelight, and Nick Backstrom, who shunned the limelight, was comfortable keeping on the praise and everything to Alex Ovechkin while he quietly went about his business being one of the best centers in the entire National Hockey League. And a tough thing for Nicky, like I talked about in the first segment, is there was that hip resurfacing procedure, and it's not something that he wanted to have done. But he had to, because even in his personal life, he couldn't tie his shoes. He couldn't play with his kids, that it was definitely a last-ditch effort. And he knew it was risky, but there was no other choice. So let's talk about one of the best Capitals players to ever skate on this team, Nick Backstrom. In some ways, this is a story we all expected, but that doesn't make it any easier. Nick Backstrom is reportedly heading back to Sweden to play for Brynäs if his hometown team. It's a soft return to hockey, a one-year deal, limited schedule, but it also quietly closes the book on a legendary NHL career. And in a bit here, I'll go over all of his stats, but, he has been, it's not often that you find a perfectly complementary player like you had in Nick Backstrom and Alex Ovechkin. And that's the hard part, is that when you think of some of the greatest moments in Capitals history, 2018 comes to mind, but all of the great goals that Ovi scored, and how many of those were assisted by Nick Backstrom. Backstrom hasn't played since October of 2023. That hip resurfacing surgery took its toll after stepping away from the team in November. This was always the likely outcome. And former GM Brian McClellan was skeptical on what kind of return he was going to get. But when after that hip resurfacing procedure was done, Backstrom actually was playing, pro hockey over in Sweden and playing rather well. So going into camp that season, the feeling was that, hey, he was playing hockey over in Sweden. Things are looking pretty good for him. But what we saw was a diminished return from Nick Backstrom. He was out there, but this wasn't vintage Nick Backstrom, and kind of ties in with the first segment of maybe holding on to a player a bit too long. But let's not forget what he meant for the Capitals. 1,105 games, all with the Caps, 1,033 points, in the franchise's all-time assists leader. That's quite an accomplishment in and of itself. 2016 NHL All-Star, 2018 Stanley Cup champion, Ovi's right-hand man for over 15 years. You want to talk about the ultimate mic drop? Just take a look at the back of his hockey card, and if that doesn't, get the warm fuzzies going with you for talking about one of the players that just played the game the right way, not verbose, not a showboat, not a guy that was like, hey, look at me, a guy that just quietly went about his business and, made the players that played around him that much better, most notably Alex Ovechkin. He is Capitals hockey. He'll finish as one of the greatest passers of his generation and a guy who gave everything to his team and is truly, in the end, in the NHL, you can bet number 19 will be going up in the rafters in D.C. Backstrom may be heading home, but his legacy here is forever. And I'll never forget his many contributions to this team, but it's one of those tough things that, I guess I was hoping for more, that we knew that this was the end of the road, that there would be more of a ceremony for a guy like Nick Backstrom that was huge. It was just, you saw him around the organization throughout the season. He, popped up, when Alex Ovechkin would reach a certain milestone or those kind of things. But it's tough that, he has been such a big contributor to this team for so many years to just kind of quietly go into the sunset. It's kind of hard as a Capitals fan. I was kind of hoping for more, but I think at this point we just need to recognize and kind of recollect the great player that he was. And it's interesting that he is going to give hockey another go of it with a Brynäs if over in Sweden there. It's a storyline that I plan on following to see, what kind of production can he get still at this point? And wouldn't that be something? And wouldn't that be a really great story if he went back over there and absolutely killed it? At the end of the day, I'm pulling for the guy, one of my all-time favorite Capitals of all time. So many great memories of Capitals hockey and Nick Backstrom on the ice that he will ever be one of the greats in my mind to ever wear a Capitals jersey. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about Anthony Beauvillier. He wants in. He's liked what he saw with the Capitals. Listen, he got off to that great start with the Islanders, played for the Penguins, kind of bounced around a little bit. And I think he wants his forever home. I'll talk about Anthony Beauvillier straight ahead. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. In the final segment here, we're talking Anthony Beauvillier, the only player that the Capitals traded for on the trade deadline. And he was one of the players that was surrounded by like, hey, and the Capitals traded for and acquired Anthony Beauvillier. I got to be honest, my initial knee-jerk reaction wasn't like, yes, that was the missing piece. But all things considered, I sold him a little bit short. He was a great addition, and, he'll make it interesting. I think that he brings a really great skill set. I think that initially where he was penciled in was like a third-line player, maybe just a depth piece, like a healthy scratch, just, break the glass and break out a Beauvillier if things really go poorly. But what did we see? We saw him even playing on the first line with Strome and Ovechkin, that the confidence by Carberry and his staff is there that he's that kind of player. But that should really come as no surprise, as he was taken on big minutes for a period of time with the Penguins, playing with Sidney Crosby. So an intriguing player, to be sure. And, it's one of the things that if the Capitals can work in some kind of deal, it's going to be tough. But the Capitals have a lot of tough decisions to make this summer, with Mangiapane and Radish and all these kind of guys, these kind of mid-level players, I guess I'm going to say. They can't be buyers on all of them because they have players that are looking for, their role as well. Like Ryan Leonard is going to be on the team next year, and perhaps Andrew Crystal. And, people want another look at Ivan Miroshnichenko, that there's only so many roster spots available. So tough questions for Chris Patrick and how they are going to proceed with these, what I'm going to say, mid-level players. And Beauvillier's big pitch, a Swiss Army knife the Caps might need. From legend to newcomer, let's talk about Anthony Beauvillier. And when I talk about newcomer, relatively newcomer to the Capitals, the only player the Capitals brought in the 2025 trade deadline, Beauvillier made the most of his 28 games in a Caps jersey, and now he wants to stay. And should that be a surprise? I mean, listen, the Capitals won the Eastern Conference. They won the Metro Division. They knocked it out of the park. That money is a motivator, but playing on an elite level team that knows how to win games and playing with the likes of Alex Ovechkin, that's a bit of a sweetener. He came from the Penguins, which, let's be honest, were one of the worst teams in the NHL. He was third in playoff scoring with 6 points in 10 games and proved he could slot in anywhere. And I think that is one of the things that kind of endear him to the Capitals organization, is that not every player is plug and play. Like, I can plug this guy in on the first line, second, third, fourth line and play flawlessly. That Beauvillier is that kind of player that he can play anywhere. So I think that it's going to be interesting where he slots in. First line, fourth line, left wing, right wing. Head coach Spencer Carberry even called him that, a quote, Swiss Army knife, quote unquote. That's the kind of player a playoff team needs. And he was huge for the Capitals in the playoffs. And you saw him step up in a way that I didn't really see coming. I didn't have that kind of lofty expectation for him, but he exceeded my expectations. Beauvillier hasn't had contract talks with the team yet, but according to projections, he could be looking at a 3-year, $3.2 million AAV deal, similar to what Richard Panik got back in 2019. So that's what I'm saying. If it's a short-term deal, but still, I liked what I saw from Anthony Beauvillier, but I still want to know what's behind door number 2 and door number 3. And ultimately, what is the future of the players that are looking for new deals? Like I said, like Radish, Mangiapane, these kind of guys. And they're not going to be able to bring them all back. How do they prioritize which player to bring back? I've heard a lot of people say that the Capitals should do their level best to try to bring Mangiapane back here. But like I said, there is only so many slots available. And can the Caps afford it? They've got about $8.6 million in projected cap space. 9 forwards are locked in. The math works if they want him back. And then you take a look at it. What kind of deal is he willing to accept? And, to a certain extent, you think to yourself, he's probably going to be willing to accept most anything if he's willing to play on the Capitals, which he said he wants to play for. But even if you want to take even a wider angle view of it, is there's players that are looking for longer term deals in the relatively near future. Connor McMichael, like I talked about here recently, I'm going to prioritize, buttoning up Connor McMichael to a long-term deal over a Beauvillier if it came to it. But then we heard other things about a big hack this summer, that are the Capitals going to really swing for the fences and try to bring in a Mitch Marner, a Nikolai Ehlers, something like that. So, it's taking everything into consideration. And would Anthony Beauvillier be comfortable playing a role as like an extra? Like a healthy scratch, kind of like what we saw from Ethan Frank, that kind of thing. If he's willing to accept something like that, then okay. And you might be saying, why would you relegate him to that? Again, it's going to be difficult in the fall to prioritize all the players that are going to fit in. A lot of people, myself included, are all in on Andrew Crystal. Do you want Crystal out of the lineup for Beauvillier in? So tough questions. And here's why I think they should, if they decide to. He's versatile, he's experienced, but still just 27. And he clearly wants to be here, which, let's face it, is a big deal for a guy who's been on 6 teams in 3 years. So you got to think, for a guy like Anthony, he is looking for stability in his pro hockey career. And it's not like a guy that came here and was awful. I actually like his game, but still kind of that mid-tier player. Not a guy that is an absolute game changer, but has a pretty good upside. And, like Spencer Carberry said, you can slot him in most anywhere, and he plays flawlessly. And some players will do that, but they don't all play as well as Anthony Beauvillier. So Beauvillier could be a glue guy for this team's middle six, the kind of player that helps bridge the gap from old core to new. So, and that's something that's going to get drawn into focus more and more. The first segment I was talking about John Carlson, a guy 35 years old, and he has a year left on his contract. That it's not even just next year. You really need to kind of take the plane up above the clouds and get a 30,000 foot view and take a look at this team and ask yourself, what are we doing with Carlson? He played good, but am I worried about what I saw from him in the postseason? Then you take a look at Beauvillier, but do I want to bring back Mangiapane, and can we afford them both? And do we want to take a big hack out there and try to bring in a big name player and still come under budget? So you got these guys like Connor McMichael, part of the long-term future. You got John Carlson, that's a big question mark. Do they go and try to get a younger blue line defender out there that has a pretty good upside? That this is going to be an interesting summer for the Capitals and how they proceed. For me, if they can get Beauvillier on a cheap deal, a short-term deal, and say, that he is willing to accept the kind of role that he's given, then I'm all about it. But I don't want to sign him up to a long-term deal if it means that we're not going to get better in, different spots in the roster. So big questions for Chris Patrick and the Capitals to answer. It is fun. It's a bit of a chess match, if you will. And, you take a look at last summer, some of those moves, I'm going to be honest, I did not see coming. So, I think that Chris Patrick and Brian McClellan still kind of the brain trust of this organization as far as roster is concerned, that they might surprise us and make moves that wow, I did not see that coming. That's the exciting part for me this time of year. There's no hockey, but it's kind of, reconstructing the roster somewhat. We don't need big changes, but I think that with that early second round exit, the Capitals are searching for stability so they can take on the best teams in the NHL. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. When you're done here, head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered 5 days a week, available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.